So this morning's passage is Acts chapter 20, verses 25 to 38. Beginning of verse 25. And now behold, I know that all of you, among whom I went about preaching the kingdom, will no longer see my face. Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all. For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. Be on guard for yourself and for all the flock, and among which the Holy Spirit has made you bishops or overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise, seeking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be watchful, remembering that night and day, for a period of 3 years, I did not cease to admonish each one with tears. Now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all those who have been sanctified. I have coveted no one's silver or gold or clothes. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my own needs and to those who were with me. In everything I showed you that by laboring in this manner, you must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that he himself said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." When he had said these things, he knelt down, he in reference to Paul, knelt down and prayed with them all. And they began to weep aloud, and falling on Paul's neck, they were kissing him, being in agony especially over the word which he had spoken, that they would not see his face again. And they were accompanying him to the ship. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, this continues on, for the majority of it obviously, with this farewell address that he is giving to the Ephesian leaders, the rulers of the church in Ephesus. There is depth, there is profundity, as the closing kind of remarks that Luke makes about the evening explain in verses 36 to 38. It was deeply heartfelt and rather emotional. So let's begin in verse 25. And now behold, I know that all of you, among whom I went about preaching the kingdom, will no longer see my face. He is, again, it's obviously fairly self-explanatory, but this is not so much prophetic as it is, I suppose, just an insight of wisdom on his part. He's not necessarily speaking with like divine revelation that he's received. The text doesn't quite indicate that. He's saying that in all likelihood, right, he knows that he won't see them again. This is obviously partly in reference to what he mentioned in the passage we saw last week, so earlier on in the speech, him recounting and recalling, especially in verse 19, the trials that had come upon him by the plots of the Jews, who were consistently harassing him, consistently combating him, consistently seeking to, in no uncertain terms, kill him. And knowing that, especially because he's wanting to head back to Jerusalem, which is the epicenter of the persecution against the Christians, he knows that there is a significant probability that he would potentially be killed there. Also, obviously, then as the rest of Scripture testifies to, not only in the book of Acts but also in his epistles, more importantly, he already clearly has plans, I would suggest at this time, to head west, which is what he does, of course, heads over to Rome, heads also eventually over to Hispania, the Roman province of Hispania, according to the early church sources. So the province of what today is, or the country of what today is Spain, the Iberian Peninsula.
Has that been documented that he really did go to Spain?
But documented enough to make it entirely plausible. Yeah. Okay. The difficulty with documentation is the question of as in outside the scriptures, the question of the weight of the evidence. So some things have enough weight where it's like, yeah, there's no reason to think this didn't happen. And kind of that's generally the way that primary sources should be approached anyway. Our tendency in modern academia is basically to disbelieve it until we decide that we want to believe it. That's how we treat everything. Modern historians just love tossing out pretty much everything simply on the virtue of the fact that someone from a long time ago wrote it. But that's just our modern hubris. Yeah, look, there's plenty of things in church history that kind of border on the pale. There are some that go well beyond the pale of believability. But Paul's movement across to Hispania is entirely within the realm of what was possible. Yeah. Okay. He's obviously eventually executed in Rome and is beheaded there. The reference to, and part of it is also what comes later on in the book of Acts, which I obviously don't want to spoil for us. So, but yes, he doesn't die in Jerusalem. He's probably at this point immediately thinking, I'm probably going to die in Jerusalem.
It's just in the realm of Paul going to Spain, Andrew going to India,
Thomas, yeah.
Thomas going to India.
Yeah, Matthew, Daniel, all those things are absolutely entirely within the bounds of what. There's no reason to disbelieve those historical records. Yeah, Matthew heading down to Ethiopia, which was just essentially everything south of Egypt at that point.
So that Matthew in Ethiopia, that's in the Acts, isn't it?
Yeah, that gets mentioned, and then yes, exactly, and so the apostles spreading out. Andrew goes up into what today is kind of Armenia and Georgia, so the Caucasus region, and yeah, all those kind of historical references exist. They're obviously not replete, but the thing is that nothing 2,000 years ago was replete. The only thing that was replete in terms of documentation is this, which is the whole point. There's more historical evidence for those apostles having gone to those places than there is for Julius Caesar existing. Good. Like with everything we know, every primary source evidence we know about Julius Caesar comes down to about 10 extant manuscripts. Okay. And there's a lot more than that for the attribution of those movements of the apostles. By the first century, the apostles or those that they discipled, either or, sometimes both, had spread to every province in the empire, even Britannia. Aristobulus, who's mentioned in passing, he's mentioned in, Paul mentions him in that kind of Christmas card list that he gives in Romans chapter 16. Aristobulus is mentioned, and Aristobulus eventually from the Church of Rome was sent to the Roman province of Britannia, which is the furthest northern Roman province in those days, just after the conquest, just after they had arrived in the days of Claudius. But anyway, yes. So yep. So you're no longer seeing face. Again, I went about preaching the kingdom. I kind of made a bit of a point about the kingdom last week, so I'll leave it at what I remarked last week. But nonetheless, yeah, his sentiment about not seeing their face is not to be taken necessarily as like a prophetic revelation of some kind that he's receiving. It's more just a remark about him knowing the probability that him going back to Jerusalem as the heartland of the persecution against the Christians is going to pose significant risk. And he's expecting, and obviously then the Ephesian rulers are expecting that they won't see each other again. And that obviously is something that's important to highlight because it impacts how we then understand the ending of the passage. Verse 26, therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all.
That's a big statement from you.
Humongous statement, yeah, on multiple fronts. There's two main fronts in which that occurred. They're both very much linked, so it's a double-sided coin, of course. But one of which is about him personally. One is more causation. Well, they're both causational. One is personally causational. The other is more attributive. And here's what I mean by that. The first reference that's being kind of drawn in here is about him being innocent of the Christian blood that he spilt. Okay, prior to his conversion. That even the one who was the hunter of Christians and the one who was the very embodiment of death to them, his sins have been cleaned and washed away by the very blood of Christ, who he otherwise would have been guilty of if he had not have turned to Christ. That in itself is a level of profundity that is almost difficult to encapsulate. That a man who was murdering people for a living can be forgiven by God. It's hard. You're hard pressed, generally speaking, to find a whole host of people, a large assortment of people who have a worse proverbial rap sheet before God than that. And if God can forgive him, then he can most assuredly forgive us. And so this is a statement. This is a statement of encouragement that if from him, speaking as him, if my sins can be forgiven, says St. Paul, so can yours, so can anyone's. It's a message of hope. If God's grace and mercy is greater and more powerful than my mass murdering, he can save anyone. Which is a concept that is utterly and entirely unique to Christianity.
And obnoxious to the secular world.
And utterly obnoxious to the enemy. Yeah, utterly obnoxious.
I mean, it could be, could be forgiven if he...
Correct.
All the
anyone you can name anyone you want. Yeah, Stalin, you can name anything, and that's not to say they are, but in terms of the ability, 100%. It's not just you're right. It's obnoxious is a good word for it. It's offensive almost. It's offensive because it destroys human self-righteousness. Okay, and here's how it does that. I think I've used this example before. I can't remember when, but I'm pretty sure it was in this context of this Bible study about Jeffrey Dahmer, who was one of, if not the worst, serial killer in American history. Nicknamed the Milwaukee Monster, he horrifically murdered about 16 or 17, we're not quite sure, but definitely 16 men between a range of about the age of, I think, roughly speaking, 14 to 32. And I won't detail for you the gory details, but it involved things including cannibalism. He's then arrested, caught eventually in the late 80s. The 80s was when he was active. He's caught, obviously then imprisoned to a billion years, or how much of a life sentence he racked up, and converts in prison, and reliably so, very reliably so. I have virtually no doubt to the validity of the story of his conversion. The records of the minister the one who ministered to him, he requested a minister to come in, so something obviously changed in him. He was an atheist, and this is part of the point about repulsion, which we'll get onto in a sec, as to why it's so offensive to the atheistic or secular mind. He requests a minister to come in who ministers to him for many weeks and months, and then reliably, comes before God for repentance and with repentance for forgiveness. Converts in the prison, and his dilemma then from that point on was, why don't I deserve to die? Right? And obviously the simply having his sins forgiven didn't alleviate the guilt, of course, that he felt. But the fact that he felt the guilt is part of the indication of his conversion, right? Because previously he felt none, and he said so as much. That's part of the repulsive element.
That's why he kept doing it.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, the bluntness of this is why I love Dahmer's stories, because Jeffrey Dahmer was asked point blank during police interviews and other such things as to why he did it, and he said, because I'm an atheist.
Why?
Because I'm an atheist. There is no God. There is no moral. There is no one above me. I can do what I want. And so what that does is that's him taking atheism to its logical conclusions. No gods, no masters, as the old phrase goes.
So you can just be an animal.
I can do what I want. Yeah. There's no one above.
Insulting to animals.
Yes, in many senses, yes. Exactly. But Dahmer's blunt honesty about the logical conclusions of atheism then is like cockroaches having a light shined upon them. It's easy to assuage and comfort our own conscience when we are in rebellion against God, when we're hiding in the dark. As soon as light shines upon it, it's blinding. And so then Dahmer's entire story is like a double whammy. One is it shows the logical conclusions of atheism, that there are no gods, no masters above me, and there is no limit to because there are no limits. I can simply do what I want. I'm a slightly more evolved primate, and there is no law in the jungle, right? Whereas atheists
But doesn't everyone have an innate
conscience? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they do. But that's what happens when when you so dharmas, you are 100% correct, yes, which is evidence of the creator, by the way. That's the whole concept of being made in the image of God. So you're correct 100%, but that's partly to my point about dharma is that this is exactly what Paul is talking about with people suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. They suppress the truth of God, they substitute it for lies and for vain philosophies that then over the course of years you suppress and suppress and suppress that conscience to the point where you don't hear its cry anymore. Seared, yes, seared, yep. Hardened heart, obviously all those are figures of speech trying to point to the kind of this reality. A hardened heart, yeah, coldness, dead in our trespasses and sins. All those analogies are meant to try and highlight that kind of reality. But then what's worse yet for the atheist is that Dharma's conversion is like a nail in the coffin, because then here's this one who has who's taken atheism to its logical conclusions, and so atheists after Dharma moved heaven and earth to make it look like that, that's not what atheists do, that's not who atheists are, we should never do that, blah, blah. But then when he converts, it's then a further insult to their atheism, because
they would have hated it.
Oh, they did hate it. They did hate it. Yeah, atheists in the 90s and the 2000s spent a lot of time, comparatively speaking at least, attacking Dharma's conversion, because it then just shines a further light in the form of specifically God extending his grace and mercy towards someone as horrifically evil as Dharma. Means that I can't turn around and, as an atheist, and point the finger at someone worse than me. Do you see how that works? It's why inevitably in a conversation about morality or other such subjects, modern man can almost never avoid somehow bringing up Adolf Hitler, right? He's held up as the kind of archetypal Bond villain, evil figure of our time, and so he's I suppose the metric or the barometer for what we constitute as evil.
But it was the people that surrounded him that probably did more evil.
Oh, no, who were categorically, and that's not necessarily some endorsement of Adolf Hitler. It's just simply Rudyard Heydrich was categorically worse than Adolf Hitler. If you ever read what they said, so the ability to always point the finger at someone worse than yourself is what then helps people of any persuasion convince ourselves that we're not that bad. That we're okay, we're fine. I'm a good person because I can point the finger, well, I'm not in prison for murder. I'm not in prison for rape. I'm not in prison for theft or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it's a failure to understand that in prison, everyone stands around pointing the finger at someone who's worse than them. I'm in here for 5 to 10, I'm in here for 10 years for
child molesters that get beaten and killed.
Yeah, correct. Yes, exactly. Yes, the irony and hypocrisy of the way that child sex offenders get treated in prison, and that's not, by the way, because they either don't deserve it or I think that it's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is the hypocrisy of someone in prison for murder or even for statutory rape of an adult attacking someone who molested a child as someone who's worse than them and deserves it is just ludicrous. You're in prison literally for murder. Right? But that's the entire point I'm trying to make, is everyone is always able to point the finger at someone worse than themselves. And it's part of our arrogance and our pride and our hubris. So, my entire point about Dharma, my entire point about the Apostle Paul, who are comparable in many ways, at least in regards to death and to murder.
But the secular world would just be totally incensed and angered. How dare he be accepted as a Christian?
Yes,
He's
correct.
a monster.
Yes, correct.
Is it because
Exactly.
It's because God sees sin very differently to how we do, I think, because it's kind of like there's a line, isn't there? And it's just how I think of it. Maybe is that there's a line, and on this side you've got God, Jesus is the bridge or the connection. And over here you might have people close to the line, but they're still waking up and having that momentarily bad thought about their neighbour, or get up and put themselves first. And half the time we don't even know what we're doing. We're even committing a sin. And then in that same side, you've got the Jeffrey Dahmers right down here.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because God's over here and he sees it all over that line. It's
Yeah.
all on the other side.
That's a valid way of putting it. Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum. So the Old Testament, and the New for that matter, but the scriptures in total, but in the case I'm specifically making a reference to, the Old Testament clearly delineates between different types of sins. So, for example, different sins, different crimes carry different penalties in the Old Testament. Not every single crime or sin carried the death penalty, for example, and it shouldn't.
Eye for an eye, wasn't it?
Yes, eye for an eye. Yeah, and that statement, as nice as supposedly nice as these kind of Gandhian sentiments of an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind sound, it shows a distinct lack of understanding of what that term means. Eye for an eye is the standard of justice, right? It's not about vengeance. An eye for an eye means an eye. If someone takes your eye, you don't behead them or take their legs. To use that, keep that analogy going.
Equal and appropriate
Proportional.
force.
Equal and proportional, yes, correct, exactly right. So there are a variety of crimes that do rightfully carry the death penalty, and well, it's easy to say in this country because we don't have the death penalty anymore, but that includes a lot more than just simply murder. But theft, yep.
Treason still incurs the death penalty.
Treason can, yep, good point. But for basically everything else, and even then, I think it's basically restricted to wartime. So there's a whole host of other jurisprudential conditions that have to be met. And so things like desertion and other such things in combat context, yeah. But yes, but so the point being made there is that sins carry different penalties and whatnot. So theft didn't carry the death penalty. Theft required restitution and a whole other things. We'll talk about that when we get through the Ten Commandments, I guess.
Would that be like, because that's how we deal with it down here, and that is God's way, and that's fine. But when we meet God in His realm,
Yep.
it's all the same. It's
Well,
kind of all. It's
Paul says, all have fallen short of the glory of God.
that's
Yeah,
kind
correct.
of what I guess.
The basic point is it's the original analogy. So whilst there's a spectrum of sins being worse or worser than others, that spectrum exists. The entire spectrum, to highlight your point again, is on that side of the proverbial line, to use your analogy. The analogy you used earlier was correct. There are those that are closer to the line. There are those that are far away from the line, but the line is still the line, and everyone's very much on the same side of the line until they're redeemed by God and brought onto the other side of the line.
We all face the earthly consequences, like that guy.
Yes,
his
correct.
earthly consequence was he was in jail for the rest of his life, and he felt he should, from your description, that the consequence should be his death, his execution.
Because
Oh,
even
exactly,
the thought of murder, even the thought of murder, you think, or the thought of trying to harm someone or something in your head. You don't do it, but you're thinking it.
That's as bad.
That's
Yeah, the thought exactly. That's what Christ highlights in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere. Yes, that he's highlighting the deeper spiritual reality, and that's not changing or watering it down. It's actually elevating it to an even more impossible level to keep. Yeah, the earthly temporal consequences. Well, Paul already referenced that in part, which I highlighted last week, about the tears and the trials and whatnot, and how going all the way back to his conversion, Christ tells Aeneas, who's the one who helps him and baptizes him eventually, when he's gone blind, Paul has, and everything else, that Paul must learn how much he must suffer for my name. To paraphrase, there's still real world earthly consequences for things. Dharma didn't deserve to be released from prison because he became a Christian. In fact, he was actually beaten to death in prison not long after that point, which
Is it because of the anger, you're a Christian, we hate you?
yeah, it ended up being that, yeah.
Okay.
Is that
a
right?
contributing factor, not the only factor, but a contributing factor, yeah. And part of it was to do then, the age range of his victims was down to about the age of 14, I think, off memory. But see, that could be viewed actually as a mercy, because it wasn't terribly long after his conversion. I think barely a year after his conversion, he was beaten to death in prison. And I could very well mount an argument that was an act of mercy on God's part, of him not having to endure the next 40 to 50 years in prison.
With that sort of guilt, feeling like,
Yes, and quite frankly, he was in a state where they didn't administer the death penalty, and he deserved to face it anyway for what he had done. His crimes, as far
How
as
come they didn't give him the death penalty? What happened?
I would need to have a look. He was obviously, I'm pretty sure he was arrested in Milwaukee, but I would need to have a look again and see if at that time.
Which state's Milwaukee?
Milwaukee's up in the Midwest.
Right up north near.
No, deep south.
Well, Milwaukee's the city I meant. Sorry, in terms of where he was arrested, where he was from. The state itself is Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
But the I'll go and look up and look at. I'll look at it when we get to the question time.
It's only states like Texas, Carolinas, Florida.
There's about 15, about a dozen to 15 states that still have the death penalty, but the death penalty is not often used in the United States much these days. Maybe once a decade.
Usually they take so long for it to be adjudicated.
Well, that's part of my. Well, that's also an issue as well because it disgraces the concept of a quick and speedy trial. People shouldn't be put on death row for 10 years. But that's a whole other opinion altogether. Anyway, getting back to the issue at hand. The other part, and this is the second side of that coin I mentioned about the innocence of the blood of all. It would be, what's the best way of framing it? It would be a very easy argument to make, not in terms of it being true or not, but in terms of just how persuasive of an argument is what I mean. The propagandistic effectiveness of it is what I'm referring to there. It would be an easy argument for the Jews to make that that Paul is guilty and responsible for the Christians who have been martyred, because he's been going around preaching the kingdom, as he says in that wording there in verse 25, and his antics have forced us to kill these Christians off. Do you get the point I'm trying to get at here? Yeah.
It must have been hard for him to kind of lose that reputation.
Oh well, yeah, absolutely, and because he was absolutely, you're exactly right. But he was, and it's because, but that's part and parcel of why he was chosen. Paul was already famous in his time, even as a young man, and that's 20 years before the time we're talking about now. This has been 20 years for him now. And so when he would go into major cities, there's no question that they would have at least heard of him. I have no doubt that when he first stepped foot in Ephesus, his reputation did literally precede him. As well as, so when I say his reputation, I mean his reputation as one of the most famous and talented rabbis of his day, teachers of the law, and of his conversion. Both of those things in tandem were already awaiting him in any city.
I think he had sort of it was a bit of a problem when he first was blinded to find any Christian that would even talk to him. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, well, we covered that when we were in that chapter. The Church of Damascus were shocked and terrified when he first walked in.
He's entrapping us.
And it took some convincing on Ananias' part to get them to come around. But that's just a human reaction. That's very understandable. And their reaction isn't condemned as uncharitable or something. It's a very perfectly understandable reaction.
It's called survival.
Yeah, survival. Yeah, it's a perfectly understandable reaction. But that argument it's not difficult at all. And in fact, I have no doubt that the Jews would have made that argument, and they would have been spreading that, and his enemies, that other Christians that have been killed along the way, because no doubt there are already plenty. There are hundreds of martyrs at this point, without question, across the world. I mean. The Romans aren't killing them yet. It's the Jews who are killing them at this point, because the Romans haven't turned on Christianity in that specific sense. That's why all the riots are always the Jews rioting, and then the Roman magistrates kind of coming in at the 11th hour trying to figure out what's going on. And so them accusing him of getting his fellow Christians killed is kind of just the other pernicious side of things. So they can't discredit what he's saying. They can't discredit Jesus having arisen from the dead. It's been coming up on nearly 30 years by this point. 25 years or so roughly from the time it happened, and they still haven't offered a single shred of proof that he didn't rise from the dead. They've done nothing to refute the evidence of the 500 witnesses, in other words. And that's not something that changed, because it's been 2,000 years and they still haven't offered any evidence that it didn't happen. They haven't been able to refute the hundreds of witnesses that saw him rise from the dead. And so so the tactic then is to just simply destroy the man. They can't crush the message because they know the message is true, but they hate that, and they know that they can't discredit it because because it happened, which is part of my whole entire reasoning for believing it 2,000 years after the fact. So instead, we'll discredit the man. Do you understand what I'm trying to explain? Yeah, it's shockingly duplicitous. It's serpentine in its
political.
Oh, it's everything. It's political. It's religious. It's everything wrapped up into a one decrepit ball. Yeah, the completely disingenuous and quite frankly serpentine way of going about this is just very dark.
Them as a pit of vipers.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah, well, yeah, good point. Yeah, I didn't think about that, but yes, good point. Yeah, it's difficult to describe how dark it is. The not being able to actually, and this happens all the time. Human beings do this, and it's disgusting. But when you can't discredit the words that someone's saying, because ultimately they're true, you have to revert to ad hominem, which just simply means against the man, and argue. You have to attack the man. It's what children do on the playground, for example.
That's what politicians do.
And it's what politicians do.
We do it to this very day.
Yeah, exactly. It's what politicians
They
do.
got that.
Yes, correct. Whenever, exactly, because it's a human thing, and it's disgraceful at any level. Yeah, children on the playground do it, and politicians in the chimpanzee cage that we call Parliament House do it. Not because I value it that way. It's because that's what it's been rendered to. Where a session of Parliament, I hear more intelligible conversation out of the chimp enclosure at the zoo. It just is, and so constant. Any media appearance is an attack from either side in anything really. Is almost always, not literally always, but almost always some kind of attack about. And this minister, blah 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 blah, and about a person. It's just completely ad hominem, largely, either tangentially or directly, and that's what people do when they can't discredit the words. They have to. The only thing they have left is to try and destroy the person speaking. So in other words, when you can't actually discredit or disprove the message, you have to try and discredit the messenger.
We see that happen all the time.
All the time. It's a failure to understand. It's a failure to understand the nature of truth. Truth ontologically stands independent in its own right. That is to say that it's irrelevant who says what. So, seeing as we mentioned evil figures earlier, and seeing as how conversations eventually, one way or another, work their way down to Adolf Hitler. If Adolf Hitler said that 2 + 2 = 4, no one has any logical grounds for saying, that statement's untrue because Adolf Hitler said it.
Yeah.
Right? That's a very simplistic, cartoonish example.
A fact is a fact regardless of the ideology.
Yeah, correct. Yes, it doesn't matter who's saying what. That's not what determines truth. That doesn't mean that a person's character is irrelevant. It doesn't mean that the person is irrelevant. They're not, because there's a whole host of ways in which the person is relevant, but they're not relevant to whether a statement's true or not, because that's not how truth works. Truth is ontologically independent, which means that by nature it stands as either true or false, irrespective of any connection it has to literally anything else in the world. But that's the only tactic that enemies of the truth have, is that when they can't discredit the truth, they have to then reduce themselves to attacking the person, mainly because, depending on how it's done, it can work one of two ways. Either it backfires, which it can, or under the right circumstances, it can actually be an extremely effective tool. Convincing people, especially a mass of people, groups of people, a mob, a mass of people, that this man or this woman is a bad apple and you shouldn't listen to them, is something that has a very good track record of being able to convince people. Because we get caught up in emotional sentimentalities, we get caught up in cult of personalities, and we get caught up in our personal feelings about other human beings, as opposed to thinking objectively about the actual idea or the concept, or in other words, the words.
That basically only lasts for so long, you know.
Eventually, yes, it's not a tactic that can work in perpetuity. You're correct.
Come through, and particularly the people who are attacking, their stupidity comes through because their own worst enemy. If you just let them go. Correct,
and exactly right. And part of it too is that those who are convinced by ad hominem arguments, so in other words, attacks against the person or the messenger, are not, generally speaking, the people who are going to be convinced by objective facts in the first place. Because otherwise they wouldn't be convinced by ad hominems. That's at least my experience. It's not a universal rule, but my experience dictates that. That's my whole point about backfiring. See, one of my, and I'll finish on this point so we can circle back to this, but one of my, I'm not the first person who thought of this, by the way, but just speaking of myself personally, one of the most consistent and effective tools I've ever had for determining whether what I'm hearing is factual or true or not, right? So whether is this person speaking the truth, yes or no, is finding out if they're saying this person is wrong, why are they saying they're wrong? Okay, so starting at that metric, and there's other metrics that can be used as well, but this is just one of them. If the reason why, if I'm listening to two people in a debate and person A is saying that the other person B is wrong because, oh, they don't have a degree in such and such, and they're not a whatever, blah 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 this, and they once co-authored a paper with. I'm speaking in academic context. That's my background, right? Then that's all those things are red flags that this person isn't actually dealing with their argument. They're just attacking the person, and that's already enough to tell me that their argument probably sucks. It's just not good enough. Because otherwise, they'd be acting honestly and speaking honestly, and they'd be dissecting and dismantling the other person's argument. Now that's an academic background because that's what it is for me. But that applies to anything, even in popular media. It applies in anything you see on the internet. Blah blah blah. Even here, it's when I make points that are where I'm highlighting deficiencies that exist at the moment in the church. You'll never hear me say, and it's because we've got too many ministers that are a bunch of idiots, and you don't hear me using these kind of no, I'm talking about the points. It's always about the points. It's always about the issue or the idea or whatever it happens to be, not about the individuals. And that's almost certainly what's feeding into that. And so, innocent of the blood of all is an extremely powerful point that he's making, where really for the first time he's defending himself but righteously. We've really never seen the Apostle Paul defend himself in any meaningful sense. Certainly not like this. All the way through the last 10 chapters essentially of the book of Acts. But here he's saying, I testify to you, or you could actually say, I call you to bear witness would be another way of translating that. He's calling them to bear witness before men and God that he is innocent of the blood of all. He is innocent of the blood that he spilt, and he's innocent of any Christians who have been killed as a result of his preaching. Because there have been Christians, obviously they're not mentioned, but we know from broader history that there have been no shortage of martyrdom since the day of Stephen, nearly 20 years ago by now. And no doubt the enemies of God, the Jews in this context, were attempting to pin those deaths on him. You got your friends killed. You forced us to kill them because you're causing trouble.
You made me do it.
Yeah, you made me do it. It's so so dark and just so horrifically evil. Anyway, continuing on verse 27. So, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. So he didn't cower in the face of that. He didn't water down his message in the face of opposition. If we, and by we I mean particularly my fellow ministers in the 21st century, including myself, need to hear that message, this is what we need to hear most ardently. I did not shrink from declaring the whole purpose of God. So he didn't change his tune. He didn't adjust his message. He didn't water it down to avoid conflict. He kept doing what he was doing.
But that's sort of like what we should be continuing to be prepared to do.
Yep, as any should. This is a universal principle. Yeah, correct. This is a perennial principle. This applies to anyone and everyone who would ever open their mouth and say that they're a Christian at any level, whether in governance of the church, whether in the pew, it doesn't matter. This is a universal principle.
Look, you don't even need to say you're a Christian. I'm the brigade.
Touche, yeah.
I've never said I'm a Christian, but at 4 a.m. in the morning after we've been fighting a fire all night, and we're sitting in the truck one of the other. You can't prove to me that God exists. I says, you're right. Let's go to sleep.
Yeah, because I highly unlikely going to be convinced. Yeah, I'm with you. The concept of not shrinking down, or to use his words, it means to reduce myself. In this case, he's more talking about the point of the message. He's saying, I did not shrink from declaring. I did not back down. I didn't cower. We often. It feeds into the next point. If we read the next verse 28, be on guard for yourself and for all the flock, for which the Holy Spirit has made you episkopos in the Greek, bishops or overseers. It means a guardian, one who watches over. That's where we get the word bishop from in English. To shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. Now, there's a theological point to make at the end there, but the first point earlier on in the verse, tying into what he said there in the end of verse 27, not shrinking or not backing down from declaring the whole purpose of God, in other words, the gospel and everything else. We've made a bit of a habit and a tendency in our time of enjoying quoting kind of seminal biblical phrases like, for example, from Joshua chapter 1, be strong and courageous, right? And that concept of being strong and courageous. Or hearkening to its inverse that's often given. So be strong and courageous is directly linked in the Old Testament with do not be afraid and do not be discouraged, right? So the command is do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Instead, be strong and courageous, right? So the opposite of being afraid is being strong. The opposite of being discouraged, obviously, is being courageous, right? But we love quoting those things, but then when the rubber hits the road, the actual implementation of those things has proven, I would argue, to fall by the wayside largely. On a whole host of issues, we have not been strong, nor have we been courageous. On all kinds of different fronts ideologically over especially the last 100 years, we have chosen respectability and reputation and comfortability, kind of spiritually and socially, over strength, courage, conflict. When I say conflict, I don't mean picking fights unnecessarily. I mean when conflict comes knocking on our door, hiding in the bathroom as opposed to answering that. Right? That's what I mean by that. We've done this on all manner of ideological fronts, from on social fronts, on political fronts, on economic fronts. We've done this in regards to a whole host of ideas and concepts stemming from one way or another from feminism, one way or another from kind of scientism as an adoration of science as the pinnacle of knowledge. We've done this in regards to social issues concerning everything from gender to ethnicity to a whole gamut of things, where we've chosen to compromise because we like remaining in academia and being respectable, or we like not losing friends, or etc., etc., etc. And that comes from reciting the words but not actually implementing them. Courage and strength, but particularly courage, inherently assumes that there is a circumstance which requires courage to actually be enacted upon. It's not just some general concept or sentiment that exists in peacetime. There's nothing courageous to be done in peacetime, proverbially speaking, as a general rule. Courage comes during times of war. Okay, it's not a universal point, but as a general principle, when things are going well and comfortably and easy, the demand that is required for courage is is orders of magnitude less than that that exists when there's conflict, when there is opposition, when there are arguments being made against you, when there are people questioning the truth of what you're saying, when there are people who are working against you, so on and so forth.
That's the hardest courage to maintain because it's continual and it's subtle.
Correct. It's subtle is the operative word. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and so therefore, you've got to be sort of ready to just like step forward. If someone says something, well, push back a little bit.
Correct. Yes, exactly. And you are right. And
with grace.
With grace, yes, but you're right. But that goes without saying. The grace and respect element, to use Peter's words, with all gentleness and respect, that he uses in his epistles, still assumes that it's pushing back though. So you can respectfully highlight that this is wrong, X, Y, and Z, whatever you're talking about, right? Because we've kind of confused the definition of what constitutes good or worse yet nice, this other unbiblical category that we tend to employ of being nice. The scriptures speak of gentleness, they speak of kindness, they speak of compassion. Our kind of modern understanding of what constitutes nice tends to depart from those definitions. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that we associate largely, in my experience at least, gentleness and respect with avoiding conflict. Okay, not wanting to upset people's feelings or their where they currently are.
It's lost me customers at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me.
Won't come back.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, but the evidence of this is why then our understanding of these things brings this cascading effect of how everything else gets interpreted. When we've already been told point blank, again, Christ is using hyperbole, which he did at times to kind of drive home a really important point. If you do not hate your mother and father, if you do not hate your brother and sister, if you do not hate your son and daughter, then you do not love me, right? He's using hyperbole to make a point, which is the point of the kind of why hyperbole exists. He's obviously not calling you to hate your family, because hatred is evil, right? The point he's trying to make is that in comparison to the love that you have for me, it would look like you hate your parents, right? He's talking about the order of precedent in regards to allegiance. I'm up here, daylight is second, third, fourth, and fifth, and then everything else, right? So in a similar sentiment, the point I'm trying to make there is that if there comes a conflict between, to use his example, if it becomes a conflicting choice between following your mother or father and following God, because unfortunately your mother and father find themselves at odds with God, you choose God. You see this through the Old Testament. The Old Testament didn't allow you to conceal sin and crime simply because your family occurred it. He says point blank in the Old Testament that if your mother, if your father, if your brother, your sister are found committing idolatry, they're to be brought before the elders. They're to be brought out in the public square, right? Not because you hate them, but because God is the one to whom we have ultimate allegiance. And when things, including people, are in contradiction to that, then we have to choose God. How does this tie into this point here? This concept of being on guard, right, in verse 28. Be on guard for yourselves. Obviously, keep in mind, he's speaking to the bishops here, speaking to the ministers.
Do you think he's just speaking to the ministers or to all the body of the church?
No, just the ministers. And the reason why I would say that is going back to...
I know he says here that the bishop, the seers and the shepherds.
Yeah, no, it comes from an earlier reference. I'll find it.
because the Holy Spirit.
Verse 17.
All of us.
Oh, no question. Yeah, in this specific context, verse 17 highlights that.
Okay.
So now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called to him the elders of the church.
Yeah.
Yep. So he's definitely just speaking to the ministers of the churches plural in that city of Ephesus. Yeah.
And is that the basis for ordination, perhaps?
The where? Sorry.
Is that the basis for ordination here? That it's a particular task, especially assigned to the bishops and ministers of the church.
Certainly, in a particular sense, yeah. When I say special, it doesn't mean that they're special and everyone else sucks. That's not what I mean by special. What I mean by special is different. That's what I mean. I mean in the literal sense of special. So being on guard for yourself and for all. It's kind of how he writes two letters to Timothy, who is kind of established as the preeminent bishop among them in the city. He speaks obviously in 2 Timothy chapter 3 about the nature of the Word of God, and he says, all Scripture is God breathed or breathed out by God. No, it's inspired by God, and it's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for rebuke, and for exhortation, that the man of God may be complete, fully equipped or sufficiently equipped for every good work. The man of God in that context, he's specifically talking about ministers, but the principle can apply to anyone else. Do you know what I mean? So there's the immediate context, but then so the immediate context is he's talking to Timothy and he's applying it to him and the elders, but the principle still applies, right? It's still profitable for all the congregants, for their teaching, you know what I mean? It also makes them fully equipped as well, right? So here, in the context of verse 28, he's talking to the leaders or the rulers of the church. Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock, right? That shepherding analogy, obviously much more commonly understood in ancient agrarian society, among which the Holy Spirit has made you bishops or overseers, guardians, in other words, to shepherd the flock to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So that shepherding analogy obviously is very replete throughout the scriptures because of that ancient agrarian context.
We still use it today.
And we use it. Yeah, exactly. And so there's nothing wrong with that. It's all analogy, which is fine. And answerable to the great shepherd himself, which is Christ. But then people forget, and this is partly to my point before I get on to the major point here in this verse, which is at the end, on that shepherding notion, the second point, this is why understanding history is also important, because you'll understand how the metaphors and the different forms of speech work. A shepherd wasn't the role of a shepherd, or the job of a shepherd, the occupation of a shepherd in the ancient world anywhere, but including in the biblical context. You think of famous figures like that, like David before becoming king, was not just merely given to some young chap so that he could, because it was some boring, unimportant job, and it was kind of, my son can't do, all the good jobs that require having an IQ higher than room temperature.
It was looking after the family wealth.
Yeah, correct. Looking after the family's wealth, because their flock is literally at a commodity at that point, functionally speaking, and more importantly, it was a dangerous job, and people don't associate shepherding with that, just by virtue of our distance from that time period, even from the medieval time period. The whole analogy, and that's why you see, shepherding and people of course think famously of the Psalms, like Psalm 23, and though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, and that's all in the context of shepherding, right? And so the connection is, well, why is he speaking so melodramatically about shepherding? Because moving the flock of sheep, moving the herder from to use a modern term, pasture to pasture, or moving them around various lands where there may or may not be much grass, there may or may not be much water, you would often find yourself moving or traversing through very dangerous wilderness, where everything from the heat to drought to bandits to wild beasts, right, animals would roam. Keeping in mind that in the ancient world, especially in this part of the world, there still existed lions and wolves and bears, depending on what you're talking about. And so that's why, like, when people hear of David fighting off a bear, they go, "Oh, that can't be. That's ridiculous." No, it's not ridiculous.
He was pretty good with the sling.
Yeah, we know how good he was with the sling. Yes, correct. And people also don't know what that looked like if they don't study ancient warfare. That was you had to be very, very athletic to do that job. Might show you a video one time if I can find
But
it.
they slept with the sheep as well through the night.
Yeah, they lived where there was nomadic. Yes, exactly. They were constantly on watch, and that's why then Christ uses a later analogy of those. We often translate it as a hireling or a hired hand in that phrase in the Gospels. Yeah, so that's someone who's basically contracting, to use a modern term, contracting as a shepherd. They're not truly a shepherd. They don't have that character. They don't have the grit. They don't have the talent. Right, but obviously it's all built on the character, and so then when they hear the wolves howling, they turn tail and run, right? They abandon the flock.
Yeah.
They leave them wide open.
They've got no vested interest in
No, correct. And often you would have a scenario where moving around, you'd have to put up an ad hoc fence, and there are times where if you didn't have the materials, you were the gate. The shepherd would literally lie down in the position where the gate would be to protect. The protect where the flock was, so he would literally put his body on the line, like not even figuratively, like literally. His staff, that whole your staff and your rod, they comfort me. That staff was able to be used to corral and to guide the sheep. Right, sheep's wandering off the path. No, but come back here. He's fallen in a ditch because he's a dumb little sheep, so I'm going to pick him up.
The best one is they pull this sheep out, it bounces off straight back into
and bounces straight back and jumps back straight in the ditch. Yeah, correct, because he's a dumb little sheep, which is exactly what we all are in comparison, myself included. But the other end of that staff was razor sharp.
Oh, it was a sharpened staff, was it? Okay, yeah.
Very often, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
To pierce and fight off anything
in
from
Australia,
bandits to wolves.
they're now using donkeys as shepherds.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah, exactly.
Donkeys will kill the dogs.
Yeah, they will often. Yeah, they'll get
They're called shepherd donkeys.
Donkeys can get surprisingly violent. Yeah.
So basically, and they're very effective.
Little dingoes and everything else. Yeah,
Yeah, wild dogs, cats, anything like that.
You can fight them off.
Kill them.
Yeah, donkeys can get violent on a turn. Yeah, they can.
Who'd have thought?
But yeah, no shepherd. Yes, but the whole shepherding thing. The shepherd needed to be able to fight off wolves, and needed to be able to fight off bandits, and that didn't just happen by using nice words.
I remember, again, this was back in the 90s, and Michelle and I went to Turkey, and we were in, I think it was Cappadocia or somewhere around that area, and there were a lot of caves and stuff. Where
That's
Christians
Cappadocia, yeah.
Used to hang out.
Yeah.
And there's old paintings.
Yes. I know. I've been there. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and there was sheep. I'm sure I saw because they used to have different. Like now we have the cross or the fish, which they had back then, but they had things like the pelicans and sheep.
Yeah.
All the symbols.
Pelicans are a very ancient Christian symbol. Yeah.
Is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, very
And
ancient.
sheep as well. I knew about the fish.
I remember seeing a sheep. I don't know if that was.
No, that's part of it, because it's associated with the shepherd staff. So that's why in many, especially in Christian traditions, you have an episcopal model of governance. The bishop carries a shepherd's staff, as we would commonly refer to it. All perfectly good.
Was that Cappadocia where I saw that?
That is Cappadocia, yeah.
Because I know we went, but I was so long ago.
It's right in the heart of Cappadocia. Yeah, it's a lot of big, massive caves that Christians lived in. That's a kind of early imperial days where the empire turned its attention towards Christianity and the persucution. So
they're hiding out.
They were hiding
out in the caves.
Oh yeah, but by caves, what I mean is like entire underground cave networks that could hold like tens of thousands. And early churches there. That you can go down the entire cave tunnel networks that were multiple stories.
That's right.
They're multiple stories deep. You can still see the remnants of where they would have the quasi sanctuary, the altar up the front, and everything else and whatnot.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they were literally. That's why when we refer to Christianity being underground, it was literally underground.
So it's spelled Cappadocia.
Cappadocia. So Cappadocia is right in the middle of Anatolia, in the heart of Turkey. So Cappadocia, Cappadocia.
Docia.
Cappadocia. So it's basically a region, Cappadocia. It's in the middle of
Is that
Turkey.
where they had the big quake
It's
years
here.
ago?
That one, yes, correct, yeah. So Cappadocia, right there in the Cappadocia in the middle. So Cappadocia, it's near. So where Colossae is.
I didn't even realise that such a huge.
Colossae and Galatia are near Cappadocia. They're around Cappadocia.
Gee, that would have to be a good secret that would be kept, because if the Romans found out, that'd be mass slaughter.
Yeah, correct. Well, there were plenty of times where they did end up getting discovered.
That was on a tour with Muslims.
Okay.
The guys were Muslims that took us all through that.
Interesting. Yeah,
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, look, the shepherding component here of guardianship, the term episkopos, which is transliterated into English as bishop, so episkopos becomes biskop, which becomes bishop. We often translate it as overseer.
I've always been looking
for
scriptural evidence or background for why you've got laity and clergy, and where that originally has been in scripture, or whether it's been something that's just happened as a part of the culture of the church.
Yeah, no, it definitely has the biblical warrant. The distinction, and it's the way in which it's to be thought of. Look, it comes down to the fact that there is a natural hierarchy. In the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, you clearly have distinction between the people,
and
the Levites, right, the priests, the king, right? And that's never presented as anything other than a good thing, and I would agree. In the same context, it's not but this is the thing though, it's not because we post-Enlightenment, modern 21st century kind of democratic idealism, and then in Australia, sprinkling a bit of tall poppy syndrome on it as well, we don't like thinking of others as being better than us in that referential term often. Not universally, I'm just saying I'm speaking very broadly and generally. There's nothing inherently wrong with highlighting that there's hierarchy. Just like in the church, like no one should get this twisted any capacity. The apostles speak with very loving, caring, fraternal language about the rest of the church. The apostle Peter even refers to himself at one. It's a passing reference, but it's there nonetheless as a fellow elder, right? When he's talking to the other elders, but none of that somehow eliminates the fact that the apostles are here and everyone else, including myself, is here. Like, no one should get that twisted, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with the apostles here and the prophets, I'm including that all together, right? Abraham here, me here. David here, me here. Moses here, me here. Nothing wrong with that.
Except when they wanted the king, and God said, really?
Well, that's a whole other... Well, the problem with the demand for a king is that they were demanding for the wrong king at the wrong time. They'd already been told that the king would come through Judah. They wanted him to come now. And they'd also had a delay in it because God was judging them for previous sins back in the book of Judges. He said that the king will come in the 10th generation. They were sitting there in the 9th generation, and they wanted a different king. They wanted a king then, so they didn't want to wait.
So God already had planned for David, which would have been the 10th.
That gets told back in independent.
I hadn't seen that.
Hadn't you? No.
Yeah.
God says to Abraham in Genesis that kings will come from your line. So obviously he's talking about all the Davidic kings, but obviously then of course ultimately Christ, and I would probably argue even further beyond that, Christian kings, post-Christ, but obviously Christ being the highest example of that. By the time you get into those later books and then through Joshua and whatnot, it's already said that the king will come from Judah, because that's going back all the way back to Joseph and everything else, the line of the tribe of Judah, that whole concept.
The only guy that stuck up for Joseph.
Yeah, correct. And so that was already said, but God was, because of idolatry and sins, God had the judgment he had enacted was that the king would come in 10 generations, and they're sitting around in the 9th generation and saying, no, we want a king now, and we want him to be from the tribe of Benjamin, not Judah. So that's often commonly gets me. If you haven't pieced the whole monarchical thing going through, it gets missed. The issue with their crying out in the days of Samuel, because that's by the time of context in which it happens, the issue isn't the demand for the king; it's what they were demanding. We want a king now. We don't want to wait, and we want him to be from Benjamin, not Judah, and we want to choose Saul because he's probably 6'4" and was a big strong guy. Yeah, was a big strong guy. And just like the kings of all of our pagan neighbours, who are all also big, strong guys and mighty warriors. So they were disobeying what God had already been telling them for centuries.
Afraid, we're kingless, and all the people around us have got kings.
Oh yeah, correct. Yeah, the book of Judges. That's why it repeats that line. The constant narrative marker of the book of Judges is there was no king in the land of Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. If you're familiar with that phrase, yeah. It's because there was no king, there was no order, so every man did what was right in his own eyes, and it was a dumpster fire. That's the whole point, kind of the book of that's why he has to raise up these judges momentarily to try and somehow bring stability and order in like a Caesarean fashion.
It always boils down to a lot of the time, doesn't it, when we seem to all go off track, and whether you're talking about Old Testament guys is when we always think we know better than God, isn't it? Like really, we've got a better idea.
We've got a better
idea.
King
from there, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
you
correct.
Want him. You know, and
they were
then
actually
it all goes to custody.
exactly. They were
and it's like, help us out of this, please.
You're just some old
they were committing.
Yeah, what do you know?
Exactly, and I can talk about this forever. But the simple point of they were actually committing the same inherent sin that Abraham committed, and the same one that Adam and Eve committed, which is trying to essentially gerrymander God's will. So one of the inherent sins that Adam and Eve commit is that's why the poetry of the completely kind of poetic nature of the way in which this kind of unfolds is just incredible. I'll explain what I mean by that in a sec. They'd been made in the image of God. They had access to the tree of life. What that is another question altogether. They were going to increase and grow in knowledge in the first place, and that already gets spelled out by virtue of being made imago Dei. One of the most fundamental components of the sin that they committed, among others, is the fact that they were literally and figuratively reaching out and taking something which was not theirs to have yet. Right?
And it's been bad for us ever since.
Yeah, yet is the operative word. A shallow reading often confuses that it happened at all. The issue that's presented when you read those scriptures of chapters 1, 2, and 3 kind of together as a unit, is that they were taking something which they were going to get, but they were trying to essentially like manipulate and gerrymander the will of God into happening on their own terms, on their own time, in their own way. And so the irony of the whole action of reaching and taking, and then like I pointed this out, like it doesn't get spelt out that way, but it's implied. Reaching up and outward to the fruit, snatching it away from its source, taking it back to yourself and then consuming it. This whole, the kind of poetic nature of what's actually going on there, reaching out and upward, taking that which wasn't theirs at that time, and then bringing it into themselves and consuming it. All the symbolism of pride and hubris, of reaching outward and upward, especially the upward component of God, becoming like God, blah, blah. And then taking it back down to their mortals, to their humans, to the human level, and consuming it. It's all like right there.
It's linked with the fracturing and breaking of all of creation by doing
correct.
it. It's like it's much bigger than just.
Yes, absolutely correct. Yes, and so that and getting into the weeds of Genesis 3 is like there's a whole bunch of very powerful language being employed there. Again, same thing or similar concept, not the same example, but similar concept occurs then in the days of Abraham. He's told specifically that Sarah will have a child,
Yes.
will,
That's right. Just
not now. So it's the same thing, just like with knowledge, just like with the whole, you will have it, not now, according to my will. That's the whole point of the fall. That's the big problem. They're gerrymandering the will of God. Abraham does the same thing by essentially trying to gerrymander the will of God, and so then you have the whole incident with Hagar and blah, blah. That's the exact same principle. Same deal when you get down to the day of the king. He's already told you that the king will come, and he'll come in this time period from this tribe.
Pretty specific.
Yeah, from this time from this tribe. They want to gerrymander the future, bring it to their present day, and so they want a king now and from a different tribe. It's the exact same fundamental sin that's occurring in the days of Samuel as it is in the days of Abraham, as it is all the way back in the days of Adam and Eve.
You've got me racing to speculate when would have God been giving us that knowledge of good and evil.
Right. The answer is we don't know, never will, and because that obviously that wasn't the will. It didn't.
It's brokenness. It's brokenness.
Yeah. But then part of it now then is then that being restored is that then that's the context in which being like God is to be understood. Those and those. That's the whole. That's the twisting of the words that the ancient serpent uses there, but that's a whole other subject.
Could it have been that Christ and the transformation of the Holy Spirit has actually restored that?
It is that open the door is it's an is, was, and will be type scenario. Sure, it's a progression, not an instantaneous thing. But yeah, it's the restoration, which is kind of my point that we were talking about with regards to the kingdom last week. But that's another issue. Guarding and protecting, and this is the last point that I want to draw in verse 28, and the rest of it kind of just generally flows from there. So if you look at the ending of the wording, verse 28, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. To shepherd the church of God, which he, referring to God, purchased with his own blood, is just one more text in a very long list of texts that demonstrate that Christ is God. Do you see how that's working? So the church of God...
So Gnosticism can take it and suck.
Yeah, or anyone who denies that Jesus is God you can't deal with a text like this. So God is the one who's in view. God is the subject here of the sentence, which he, in reference to God, purchased with his own blood. Well, the blood, obviously the blood that was spilled on the cross. So the one who spilt his blood is being referred to explicitly as God. Okay. Now, for everyone who already believes that, it's kind of like cool, and water is wet. But the point I'm trying to draw is that this is just one more instance of the scriptures clearly highlighting that Christians believed from the very beginning that Jesus is God. Okay.
Is that in here or is it some other reference?
No, this one here, it's in the ending of verse 28.
28.
Yeah, ending of verse 28. To shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. The wording might be slightly different depending on what translation.
Yeah.
Yep. Which he purchased with his own blood through. You can also think, yeah. So God is clearly identified as having purchased the church. Purchased meaning redeemed, with his own blood. So it's identifying Christ as God.
But of the ASV says of the Lord.
Lord, same thing. I mean, God's probably more direct translations, theos, but Lord applies as well. Lord is the Greek usage of the divine name. Yep. Which the Lord or God purchased or redeemed with his own blood. Clearly identifying that Christ. Yeah. So any arguments that you know, kind of like Michelle was actually speaking to on the weekend when he asked me the question about Constantine and about the kind of modernist view that Constantine kind of turned the church on its head and changed things and co-opted things, which unfortunately prevails today. These kinds of passages demonstrate that that's not true, because we're 300 years before the time of Constantine, and you clearly have Christians believing that Jesus is God, and it wasn't some later invention. And so when the Muslims claimed it was a later invention, it wasn't, although this still fits because their claim is that Paul changed the Christian religion. But that's another issue altogether. This is a clear demonstration that the Christians believe that Jesus is God.
Yeah, I think that made sense to him, by the way. We talked about it when we got home. He was
Yeah.
I've never thought of it that way. Oh,
Well, yeah, on that,
yada,
the specific point we're talking about there is that when people talk about Constantine converting to the faith and then the Roman emperors after him, ultimately, and then Theodosius the Great, by the end of the 4th century, making Christianity the official religion of the empire, is seen by some evangelicals today in the 21st century as a negative thing. The question I always pose to them from church history is, then what should the Roman emperors have done otherwise? Should they have remained pagan? Should they have continued with Caesar worship? If not Christianity, then what? But that's because of our modern issue of secularism. The whole myth of it is that, which I do explicitly call secularism a myth, this idea that you can have all the religions kind of like players on a sporting field, and then our secular principles is like the umpire or the referee, keeping everyone in check.
That means we're pretty doomed then.
Well, yeah, but that's the whole modern secular experiment in the West. You have to head off. No, that's fine. You can do it. The issue with that is, it's just at that point, atheism is just your state religion. It's not a matter of whether a country and a government or anything else, it's not a matter of if it will have a religion, it's a matter of which one it will have. And that's always the case, and it's inescapable. So if the Roman emperors should not have converted to Christianity, or if Christianity should not have been made the state religion of the Roman Empire, then what religion should be?
It would stop a few people.
It does, because it's a historically based argument as well as philosophical. What is your alternative? Because my point is we've self-deluded we've deceived ourselves into thinking that there is this concept of secularism, but we're living through a real world live action example of the consequences of that idea of secularism, where nothing ends up guiding, but it's not nothing because something else replaces it.
Yeah.
And now it's just an entirely new age ethos that now is driving our society because secularism was always a lie. So, continue to verse 29. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Again, he's keeping that whole analogy we touched on earlier, but he's comparing deceivers and false teachers and self-professed prophets and so on as savage wolves. An apt description. And from among, verse 30, and from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. He's pointing out two obvious things here. Well, sorry, two things that need to be obvious to them. One of them is obvious, one of them is not as obvious. He's comparing and contrasting these two sentiments, right? And I'll explain what I mean by this. So the comparison is between verse 29 and verse 30. So verse 29, talking about savage wolves that will come in among you, not sparing the flock. So it's an external threat, right? You can just follow the direction of the adverbs and the pronouns. I know that after my departure, wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Come in, right? Into. He's speaking about an external threat breaching the church. Does that make sense? And is identifying them as savage wolves. Wolves are not terribly difficult to identify at all. Especially, and this is where it's important to follow the analogy, and that's why understanding them is how you make sense of these texts. It'd be no different than if we wrote something today in the 21st century English. Wolves here are being contrasted with the flock, okay? Because that's the whole shepherding analogy going back into the previous verse. The ability to distinguish between a wolf and a sheep is very easy. It's not difficult at all. One's soft and fluffy, the other has very sharp teeth. One is ferocious and intimidating, the other is well-meaning but often dazed and aloof. This is not necessarily an exhaustive commentary.
Anything related to the fact that wolves work in packs as well?
Yeah, certainly for sure. Yeah, it's mainly an ontological description about the wolf as a wolf.
Okay.
But yeah, no, there's no. You can certainly extend it like that depending on the circumstance, sure. But the main comparison is ontological. Wolf as compared to sheep. The shepherd then, again, the shepherd distinguishing between his wolves and his sheep. Obviously, there's the kind of whole the biblical analogy of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so that's describing a similar kind of concept. It's a wolf masquerading as a sheep, to keep that agrarian analogy going. But at the end of the day, it doesn't take a whole lot of work to identify that. You kind of have to be blind to it to not see it, right? But if you're blind to it, that's already the problem in and of itself. Not even the presence of the wolf, it's the fact that you're blind to it. A wolf attempting to masquerade as a sheep is kind of a cartoonish image, and that's kind of the point. If someone can't identify that wolf, that's the problem. But very important to distinguish that from this other category that he's mentioning. Okay.
Just before we get to that, how in modern day, amongst, like in church today, it's a volunteer organisation except for the clergy.
Essentially, yeah.
And so therefore anybody could come in and do or say anything.
Correct, yeah.
Behave in any way.
Yep.
How, as an organisation, do we
Defend against it?
Yeah.
Fortunately, the answer is very simple. In principle, the problem is then the will to enact it. Christianity has an extremely simple solution to that. It's just called church discipline.
Because I've had to eject people out of a church. We were in the middle of a service.
Like a service,
I had
yeah.
to actually get up and basically get them out of the church.
Yeah, and that can always happen. Yeah, and so it's
What are they doing?
They were screaming from the back of the church, trying to override the minister, and I was the chief warden at the time, so I
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Yes, correct.
flicked the phone open, had police on fast dial, and was telling them I was ringing the police over to get out.
Yeah, there's all those kinds of scenarios, and even those overt examples exist. Then on the more or the less overt rather examples is where yes, church discipline is the guardianship of this, and more importantly, this is why there is a continual exhortation. The single most consistent command given to the clergy in the scriptures is exactly what you're seeing here: be on guard, be watchful, be vigilant. All these terms are similar. Sometimes the words are exactly the same. It's always this borderline militaristic language, right? It's a guard. It's always, and even that term episkopos, it means one. A literal understanding in the way it gets applied would be it means one who is watchful. It has this ocular concept to the word. I won't give the entire etymology, but it means one who's watching closely. When I've explained this to soldiers before, I've explained that this is someone on a sniper team in Overwatch, looking through a varial optic, and they're sitting a kilometre away from the target, but they're seeing right up close on the target through their optic. That's the kind of connotation of someone who's watching with a keen gaze, right? So that's why overseer gets translated in. That's why in the 20th and 21st century it's been translated into English as overseer, overseeing that concept, like seeing over what's going on.
Oh, in a lot of computer games, they just call it Overwatch.
I suppose, yeah, Overwatch, yeah, overwatching, yeah. It's like a general watching over the battle.
You watch your own crew, what they're going to do, and
yes, correct. It's mirroring what God does for the church in the first place. So that's why the whole shepherd analogy works, because it's the shepherds, but then Christ is referred to as the great shepherd, right? So yeah. And so, but it's always all this language. It's always this language. The single most common is always about guardianship, and because episkopos does also carry within it, in its semantic domain, the concept of being a guardian or a watchman, vis-a-vis watchmen on a night wall, like in the Old Testament, for example, watching over a city at the night time. Right, that's that kind of language, and that's because savage wolves coming as an external threat, right? So those enemies outside the church who are seeking to break into it, right? That's the savage wolves. But they're easily identifiable for anyone who's not completely asleep at the wheel, right?
Do you think as like scripture, it's for correcting and educating and all that, do you think is that's sort of like a natural internal protection against it?
Yes, well that's exactly what I was referencing earlier from 2 Timothy chapter 3. That among exhortation, the other concepts are reproof and rebuke. Reproofing means correcting, in other words. Rebuking means refuting. So highlighting the error of someone else is basically what rebuking means. And those are to be done a certain way with a certain character, but they're still to be done. But that circles back to my point about courage and cowardice from earlier, and our conflict, our reverse stance toward conflict, without realizing that the scriptures ad infinitum say things like, "Better are the wounds of a friend than the kisses of an enemy." Okay, the truth which hurts but later heals is better than the lie which comforts but then kills. Okay.
Is that a proverb, is it? Or?
No, that's just me off the top of my head. But
Sounds like it should be a proverb, doesn't it?
Well, I suppose. No, the wounds of the friend is, I'm talking about that latter part. Yeah, the wounds of the friend, that's from, I can't remember where the proverb, that's from the Proverbs, and from the wisdom literature. That mine was just a further extrapolation on that. But that's that concept. Yeah, the wounds of the friend is better than the kisses of an enemy is one of the Proverbs. And so the command then, right, but notice the contrast, and this is important between 29 and 30. So savage wolves, in opposition to the sheep, are easy to identify. Okay, even if they try to masquerade as sheep, it doesn't take much investigation to realise their true nature. Okay?
External threats.
Yeah, external threats though, coming in. And showing a continuation of thought, from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. From among your own selves, the bishops of the city, right, the leaders, men will arise, i.e. from within.
Yeah, we're seeing that.
Okay, so it's those. So they're not an obvious external threat. They are a surreptitious, almost covert internal one. Okay. They not only look the part, they also largely act the part. But upon a deeper examination of them is required than that which is necessary for the wolves. As I said, a wolf will attempt to masquerade as a sheep, hence that whole ridiculous kind of concept. It's meant to be ridiculous, but that's the point of why it's said that way. A wolf in sheep's clothing, because of course it's ridiculous. The mental picture that's meant to be drawn is of a wolf with dark fur and sharp teeth. That's like, put a bunch of white fluffy wool on himself. Like it's meant to be a ridiculous analogy, but that's the point. Is that they have a facade of it, but upon examination, and not that much of an examination is needed to realise their inward nature. This is much more sinister, I would argue. It's much more clandestine, or covert rather. They not only have the surface level appearance, they also have a bit of substance to it as well. And that's where it gets dangerous, because it's much more difficult to identify. And that's why but at the same time though, that's why there is such a consistent, such a consistent command for anyone, for any Christian, Old or New Testament, the command to have and to increase and to grow in discernment. Okay, the ability to discern, i.e. to distinguish. Discernment inherently means distinction. It carries with it the connotation of being able to identify one thing from another, to separate one thing from another, to say this is not that and that is not this. Okay, that's what discernment is. It's the ability to draw a line between two different things. Discernment is also then presented as a gift, pretty clearly as well in the scriptures, among other spiritual gifts. There are people who are acutely discerning, and there are people who are utterly asleep at the wheel. For a variety of reasons, but it's also a gift. So part of it is then understanding that those who lack in discernment at the present time need to be protected by those who do have discernment. And that's not an insult to people. It's not meant to be taken as derogatory. It's just simply taken as a statement of fact and is meant to be beneficial. Yes, Tanya. And is to be taken then as just part and parcel. Catch you later. It's no different than when the scriptures exhort those who are strong and courageous to defend the weak and the poor. Okay. Ideally, people should not be weak. Ideally, those who are poor, and obviously poor carries the surface level connotation of like material poverty, but then obviously as the New Testament reveals, the Old Testament does too, but particularly the New Testament reveals the concept of poor in spirit. That's really what it's largely talking about. The poor in spirit are the ones who recognize that they're poor in spirit and cry out to God so that they're no longer poor in spirit. But those who are poor in spirit or those who are weaker in the faith need to be protected by those who are stronger in the faith, and that's a perfectly natural and good thing. People progress in their sanctification at different rates. I've met people who have been Christians for all of 5 years who have more maturity than those who have been Christians for 50. Again, these are all general principles, never universal. As a general principle, elders are much wiser and more discerning than the youth. And that is overwhelmingly and largely true. And my own age would never I would never presume unto myself that that's not true, even at my age.
I think it's
No,
all
our
part
elders
of
are
the body
definitely
of
wiser.
Christ. It's all part of that
Yeah.
idea that we've all got a part to play.
Yeah.
And we all have, and whatever is done, the thing I'm trying to get my head around is if I'm rebuked by somebody that I know is speaking from the gospel, what I'm trying to do, and it doesn't always work because of pride and whatnot, but what I'm trying to do is go, this is all for the glory of God. None of this matters. I don't matter. That person who's told me this doesn't matter. This is all about bringing glory to Him. That is the bottom line.
Well, our desire for significance
But it's always done respectfully.
and ego is totally like fulfilled by the
Correct,
fact that
yeah.
the God of creation has a personal, minute by minute interest in us
Yes.
and
Yeah.
who we are and what we're
Yeah.
stuff. So that's
All true.
so basically, any sort of worry about I've hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
And stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that you should
Yeah.
suppress that.
No, but that's no. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
I think, and even if they don't say it respectfully, the truth, it's like what you were saying before, it's about the truth. It's about that essence, that
Oh, yeah.
truth. It's
I've
not
been-
about
I've-
how
yeah.
it's even delivered. I mean, of course we should be doing it respectfully, but even if it's
Yeah.
not given
No,
to
I've been told things have been categorically true, and the person never should have said it the way they did. But at the end of
Yeah,
the
but
day,
you-
at the end of the day,
Yeah.
especially at the end of the day, for me, especially as a man, am I going to sit around whinging about how they said it, or am I just going to get over it
Grab
and
that
actually
and run, yeah.
and actually run with what's true? Yeah, as if I'm going to sit here and wallow in the fact they didn't
Yeah.
say it nicely to me.
Yeah. Easier said than done sometimes, but
It
yeah, that's...
is, yeah.
Oh, I know that, but it's just yeah. But it's not. But as a man, I have no excuse for wallowing over how they said it. I can wish all I want that they said it a different way, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change whether it was true or not. Yeah, correct.
Can I just say one thing I saw recently? One thing that I've been looking at. There's a young guy, an American guy. Seriously, I think he's 19, but he looks like he's 12. Seriously, his name's Jaden Forrest. He's pretty sure he's an American kid.
Yeah.
And he posts all this stuff. He's a Christian. He's been Christian for a year. He talks about how he used to chase girls and smoke weed and
Typical, yeah.
do whatever. And he's now a Christian, and he quotes the Bible constantly, which I really like about him. But he posts up these YouTube type videos of all different things, like Ben Sharpo having a debate with William Craig Lane or William.
Okay. Yeah, William Lane Craig. Yeah.
Or those, all this sort of thing, and then he'll discuss it at the end, and I think he's amazing for someone so young. But one thing he did do, and it ties back to verse 30, was he showed this. In America, it was called the First Baptist Church, and it's
I know about them. Yeah.
okay, big.
Terrible
I don't know anything
Terrible
about it.
church.
This is all new to me.
Yeah.
Big columns out the front.
Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, this evangelist comes and stands out the front. This guy, and he's got I'm not being awful, but he's your quintessential American event. Like, he's got his banner, Jesus saves you from hell, with flames and stuff all over it, and he's standing out the front.
Yeah.
And then have you seen this? And out comes this pastor.
No, but I know Westboro Baptist Church, yeah.
Yeah, so the pastor comes out and says, "Hello, can I help you?" And he says, "Yep." He said, "I can see you've got all these things hanging off the front of your church, and one of them was, about refugees are welcome and whatnot, and that wasn't his problem." But he said, "What does that flag mean?" And of course it was the rainbow flag. He said,
okay.
"I see you've got the..."
Might not be Westboro then, yeah, fair enough. Keep going though, yeah.
The gay flag.
And he takes him on.
Yeah.
This evangelist takes him on.
Yeah.
And this guy comes at it from a point of, oh no, it's all about inclusiveness. And he said, but by doing that, you're watering down, which we've been talking
Well,
about.
that would be correct, yeah.
Watering down the gospel. The gospel says, and he quotes Acts and Romans. Cut a long story short, this pastor comes up closer to him, and the evangelist says, "No, stay away.
Yeah.
Stay away." And this evangelist then goes, and his mate then comes out to see what all the fuss is about, and he says, "Oh, can I ask what version Bible you're quoting from?" He said, and the guy said, I'm quoting from the King James Bible," and he said, "Oh no, we use the NIV." Well, I use the NIV.
But like that doesn't make a difference anyway. The NIV doesn't say that. The NIV doesn't say that the LGBT is fine.
Yeah. So I mean, he's missed the point entirely. But then he starts down the road of saying, "Look, the pastor says I'm not on board with Paul. Paul is and then they start using this word Apollyon. And then the pastor accuses him of being what is that?
Apollos,
He's throwing all this stuff, and in the meantime, this evangelist is annihilating him. That church got closed. They show you a few weeks later, and he says to that pastor, he said, "You need to change your ways, or this church will close." Next thing.
Well, a lot of church. The irony is that a lot of churches that have conceded to the sexual revolution and to LGBT ideology and everything else are dying off now. That's the issue.
But I think that,
They're growing in one sense, but many of them are dying off.
I think the difference should
Which
be
is a good thing.
that we accept people for people. And yeah, we don't necessarily accept the sins that they are involved with. I mean, Jesus accepted, talked to the Samaritan woman at the well.
Yeah, and that's part of exactly. But what churches like you are right, yeah. What churches like that do though is they have at that point in no uncertain terms they've committed apostasy. They are, and the only way to do it is then every single one of them when they get to that point they've done a number of fundamental things. They reject the infallibility of Scripture. They reject Paul ultimately.
Totally.
And then you just it's a cascade effect because the only way to make it work, because the Scriptures are very very clear on even just speaking about that specifics because it goes across the board. But just to speak on that specific subject, because the Scriptures are so plainly and abundantly clear across the course of the entire Scriptures about human sexuality and about marriage and everything else.
Yeah, and what families.
What a family is, everything else. The only way to, like I was speaking of that cognitive dissonance earlier when we were talking about stuff, the only way to alleviate that or to bridge that gap is when you don't want to change your idea, change the source material, in other words, the Scriptures, to then make it suit what you've already decided is true.
Which is what we were talking, it's the whole gerrymandering.
In many
It's
respects,
kinda
it's gerrymandering.
It's kind of like, well, I'll make it fit me. We want it now.
Yeah, correct.
We don't like the way you've written that.
I know exactly. I don't like the way you've written that, and so you end up having scenarios where Paul is speaking. They just basically completely. They have to obliterate the infallibility. They have to obliterate its infallibility. They obliterate it being inspired by God, and in doing so, that's what then opens the door for them in their head to then justify anything else from that.
But that's what this evangelist said. He said, so you are just not even ignoring, you're discrediting.
No, they discredit it. No.
The vast chunk of the
It's just
New
it's a
Testament.
shame it's the Westboro Church, though.
No. By the sounds of it, it's not Westboro. By the sounds of it, it's someone. By the sounds of it, it's someone. By the sounds of it, it's a legitimate evangelist going against. I thought that was originally as well.
Yeah, that's what I
by the story, by the way that story played out, that's why I said I don't think it's at Westboro. It's a legitimate evangelist going against a church that's gone completely off the deep end.
Yeah, taking on the pastor and everything.
I thought it was originally going Westboro direction, but it's obviously not Westboro.
I don't know who they are.
No, that's a whole different.
This is like First Baptist Church, but look it up. It's on a young guy called Jaden Forrest.
Yep.
No, I'd have to look it up. Yeah.
But if what was the word you used? Apollyon.
It's Apollos. It's
What
in
is
the
that?
Scripture. Paul talks about it.
Yep.
Some follow me, some follow Apollos. It makes no difference. We all
Follow
Apollos.
Christ, yeah. So there's divisions in the Corinthian church where some were putting more favour on different apostles and other disciples, and kind of cults of personality were developing to a degree, and Paul was trying to quash that.
Right.
That whether someone places more, they focus more on the words of Apollos or of Paul or of Peter, they're all still ultimately following Christ. So it's the same as
to follow Apollos because we have no written.
But they would have because they had experience with him. So part of it would be.
I mean, today though.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, exactly. That's why context always matters. Yeah, exactly. So it's the same degree, for example, in you can play out one kind of example of that in. I'm going to be hesitant how I say it because it's not. I don't want to make too broad or too sweeping of a claim that I can't back up. The Roman Church's elevation of Peter above the others to a degree that I would argue is a distinction unwarranted. So I would argue that Peter is among those who have preeminence. So I've actually made that argument before, even as a Protestant, that Peter clearly has a sense of preeminence alongside of particularly, well, obviously during the ministry of Christ, it's him, James and John. That's clearly the inner triumvirate, the inner circle, and everyone else and the other disciples are around that for sure. That's very obvious.
But they're obviously in agreement to that too.
Yeah, in agreement to that. Yeah, Peter clearly has a sense of preeminence at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. He is also among those who have preeminence. James also does as the bishop of the city, though. So James there as kind of clearly the chief minister among the Church of Jerusalem. So it's not just Peter, but Peter is among that, right? But the Roman church's elevation of Peter to such a distinction above the others, I would argue, is unwarranted. But not because he doesn't have it, just doesn't have it to that degree, is my point. Yeah.
Again, it's not a salvation killer, though.
No, it's not at all. No. No, because the Armenians, the Armenians place great value on Andrew as the man who brought Christianity to that region of the Caucasus. The Indian Christians, particularly in the south, place great emphasis upon Thomas because he brought Christianity to the Indus Valley, etc., etc. Right, there's no problem with any of that. It's the same as how in Western Christendom we place far more, in terms of how many books are written, in terms of how much is studied. We study Augustine far more than we study almost anyone else in the early church, because he was from the West. Does that make sense? Those of the Reformed branch or the Protestant branch have much greater familiarity, generally speaking, with figures like Luther or Calvin or Knox than they do with Ephraim or other such figures in Eastern Christianity, right? Whose names, all the Desert Fathers from the East. They don't, most people, if you ask them who the Desert Fathers are, they wouldn't know who they're talking about, which is understandable because it's just the geographical distinctions. But yes, the point here being drawn is the distinction between wolves, ravenous wolves, broadly speaking, easily identifiable, who come from without, so in other words, come from outside, versus those who rise up from among you within. And notice they're not given some obvious descriptor of savage wolves. They write, verse 30, from among your own selves, believers, and by extension the church, men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw the disciples away after them. So it's
wolves from in among you, are they deluded themselves, or are they deliberately?
Yeah, look, it's often great. That's actually a very good question. It's often self-deceived. Yeah, so that's why it's much more difficult to distinguish, and that's kind of the point that he's making here. The careful descriptors. So the outside ones are described as wolves, whereas the inside ones don't get described that way. Not because they don't do the same thing. He's talking about this kind of identifier. Because it's all still in this shepherding analogy, right? It's in this agrarian analogy back from verse 28 of the whole concept of the flock. So the wolf and the sheep, very easy to tell apart, right? Even, as I said earlier, the wolf in sheep's clothing, that kind of cartoonish image, not difficult to figure out. They're surface level looking kind of like a sheep, but then upon a very quick analysis, you can tell that they're a wolf. Here, these aren't described as being obviously wolves. They're described as being men just like the elders, just like the bishops of the city. And they rise up from within. So they've been in the church for a while. They're known. People know them. People have worshipped with them,
Connection.
been with them, walked with them, talked with them, dined with them, had communion with them, blah, 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 blah. But they rise up. They one way or another increase in their power within the church, their control over other people.
Is there anyone at present that would be like that? That we would...
Well, it's not even a question of being like that. See, this can occur all the way down even to this concept could I won't say easily, but this concept could happen here.
Yeah.
It doesn't. That's what I'm saying about its overtness. So for example, I could point to blindingly obvious examples of wolves, like let me just pick. It's low-hanging fruit, but I'm going to pick it as an example. So the American preacher Joel Osteen would be a classic example of this. A cursory analysis of any average sermon that he delivers clearly demonstrates that this is not Christianity. This is just basically glorified. Like I could get the same message from Oprah.
Could you just say that?
Joel Osteen. This is Joel Osteen, pastor at a massive church called Lakewood down in Houston, Texas.
Okay.
Congregation of about 35 to 40,000 roughly. Across weekly attendance on average.
Would we throw Hillsong into that sort of thing?
I would too, largely. Hillsong's a bit less so, but I would largely throw Hillsong into that. So Osteen is, and he's
How
not
do you
yet.
spell his last name?
I believe it would be Osteen, but it's shockingly low-hanging fruit. It's basically, he's just simply a kind of Oprah Winfrey-esque self-help guru. So his messages, his sermons are always just typical modern, almost new age self-help guru type guidance kind of thing. It's 3 keys to financial success. It's 5 steps to being more happy in life. It's blah 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 blah. It's never actually.
The church of self.
It's the church of self. Yes, it's this therapeutic moral deism. God is essentially simply there to make you happier, healthier, and wealthier, and to achieve the American dream. Right? That's basically what God's there for. They will move heaven and earth to not mention a whole host of concepts like sin. If they can go out of their way to avoid it, they will. It's the kind of archetypical celebrity pastor kind of problem we're having at the moment in the West. The levels of fame that pastors are achieving, not because people won't be renowned, right? We talk about church. We're sitting, in a church history class, we're talking about people thousands of years ago now. So of course it's going to be renowned, but they weren't in the job to get wealthy and famous. That's the difference. We talk about the fame and renown of. I could pick any example here, but let's just go with Athanasius, Saint Athanasius. So as Archbishop of Alexandria, during the height of the Arian heresy, he's exiled 5 times. He's imprisoned. He staves off a riot. He's nearly killed, but eventually prevails, right? As opposed to the modern celebrity pastor phenomenon, where you live in a $10 million mansion bought by the church, and you drive around in a Rolls Royce and you have a private jet, and you hide that under it came from our book sales, right? As if your book sales aren't directly tied to your pastoral work, right? Your Hillsong, and you take $150,000 vacations in Cancun, Mexico for 3 days.
They're just around the corner from where my parents
Well, yeah.
Can you just drill down on the saying perverse things? What's that? I mean, Paul.
Yeah.
What was the words that Paul picked to say that?
Yeah, the literal. So, fortunately, the English translation of the perverse words is a fairly direct translation. The perverse words means twisted. It means corrupt.
Okay.
So corrupt. So in other words, corrupting the truth. Okay. It's poisoning it. So that's why that's to draw away. There's this element of seduction almost kind of implied here, right? Okay. So perverse or corrupt things, seeking to draw away, to lure those who are in the faith away from the truth, but itself actually posing as the truth.
That's a fairly serious. It would be better.
It's more serious than the other one.
Yeah. It's
well, they're both serious, but
better to have a millstone tied around your neck and to throw it into the deepest water.
Yeah, than to pervert the innocent.
Someone away from the fact.
Exactly. Yeah, almost in that sense. Yeah, exactly. Like Jesus' own words about perverting the innocence of children can be applied here in that same broad sense about children in the faith. Yeah. So the way that this, generally speaking, plays out at any time in history, but including our own, where it's happening left, right, and centre. Is those who are younger in the faith, those who have been Christians for all of 5 minutes, comparatively, not literally, are susceptible. They are susceptible to this thing because they lack discernment. But they understandably lack discernment because they haven't been Christian for long, or they might have been Christian for a couple of years, but they haven't really received that robust teaching yet, which they should have been, unfortunately, but they haven't. Discipleship, all these various different confluence of factors that kind of play into it. But what then happens is you have someone who speaks confidently, someone who speaks nicely, and someone who is, to one degree or another, charismatic. I don't mean that in terms of theology. I mean like their charisma. Their charismatic personality is what I mean. It's very easy to have the facade of religiosity and spirituality when you're like that. Especially because a lot of what we do in the life of the church is, what's what I'm looking for? I'm hesitant to say abstract, but it kind of is that way. So I'll use this by comparison. you have a construction company. This could apply to anything. I'm just using an obvious one. You have a construction company. Figuring out whether the 19-year-old kid you just hired actually knows what they're doing or not is not a terribly difficult task to figure out, right? You're not going to sit down and have a 3-hour conversation about the abstract concepts of construction. You're going to get them on a site and see if they actually know how to do the work with the tools, right? It's very hands-on is what I'm trying to say, okay? This could apply in all kinds of different fields. When you're selecting someone for a sports team, you don't sit down and interview them about their philosophy of how the game should be played. You get them out on the court or out in the field, put a ball in their hands and see if they can actually if they have talent, right? Hands-on. A lot of things in the church, and it's not a problem, it's just the nature of how different things are. A lot of things in church are abstract, not necessarily practical.
Conceptualised.
They're conceptualised, yeah, that's what I mean by abstract, yeah, they're conceptual things.
Yeah. We used to have to try and find people that could conceptualise first, and code second.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that doesn't mean there's no practical elements in the church. There clearly are, but a lot of it is a larger portion of it is abstract, i.e., conceptual. So, like when I'm delivering a sermon in the liturgy, it's entirely an exercise in the abstract. So I'm doing nothing physical. I'm just standing there and speaking, right? So it's conceptual. It's up here as opposed to here. What that does, though, is that then it makes it more difficult, not because it's a problem, it's just the way that the nature of things are. You have to be, especially, that's why there's such a heavy emphasis on discernment, because discerning whether someone can play a sport well or not, it's not that difficult. For someone who knows how the sport should be played, it's very easy to identify. Especially if you've been doing it a long time, you can watch someone for all of a minute or two and figure out if this person is good or not. When it comes to someone, the communication of ideas and concepts and how they then apply, much more difficult because it's all up here as opposed to here. That's why this kind of thing can happen. That's why having discernment, which is also an abstract thing, it just makes it much more susceptible to these kinds of things. There is no safeguard against that except for being watchful and discerning. Okay. That's why the commands are all there.
Look, conceptualisation is really important. Like, for example, if you want to try and put a basketball into the hoop, you do much better to conceptualise it first happening.
Absolutely.
Do it second.
100%. Yeah, correct. And so there's definitely, exactly, that's not to say there's not a conceptual element. In terms of the balance of percentage, conceptual versus material or abstract versus material, if I want to figure out if this kid can play, I need to watch. I can watch him for about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and I can figure out, at least broadly speaking, what level he should be at. And that just comes from experience and knowledge, right? But you can tell it very quickly. If you're trying to figure out where someone's at the minimum, you need to sit through at least one sermon, and that's going to be a 30-minute exercise. And that's not all you should do, because you should really probably listen to what they've been saying for the last 6 to 12 months. And then you can figure it. So it's much more in it. That's my point. It's much, much more involved. Because it's ongoing. It's the life of the church. It's week to week. There's the Bible study and this meeting and the church services, and it's all these things wrapped up together, right? Much more difficult to discern. And so you're susceptible to it, but there are protections against it, which is taking that guardianship element seriously. And everyone has a responsibility for guardianship, but the guardianship ultimately and primarily and overwhelmingly falls to the leaders of the church. And there might be instances where the congregation doesn't quite see the whole picture, which is going to happen because it's like the soldier on the battlefield not seeing the whole battlefield. Of course you don't, because you're on the front, you're in it. The general, who's not on the front line because he shouldn't be, he's the one seeing the whole battle play out, right? That's how this works. And so, those who rise up from within, it can occur over the course of years. It can occur over the course of decades. It's surreptitious. It's happening right in front of you, which makes it a lot more difficult to see. It's almost like hiding in plain sight. And the number one way, though, to finish this concept, the number one way this starts to fester is when and I'll explain what I mean by the concept in a minute in terms of the words if I need to, but it's when little what I like to call petty kingdoms get established in churches.
Turf wars.
Yeah, almost turf wars. Yeah, good point. Yeah, petty kingdoms. What I mean by that is you have the ministers or the minister overseeing the church, whatever the nature is. But then there's all these little different things that go on in the church. Naturally, there's the Bible study. Even just for us, it's the Bible study. There's multiple different prayer groups or meetings, and then the Sunday liturgy, blah blah. One or multiple of the ministers of the church are involved in X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's responsibilities for different fields, and that's pretty standard and usual. That makes sense because different ministers have different talents or abilities. But then within all the different aspects, the little pockets of that church's life on a week-to-week basis, they can, if people are not careful, become the perfect environment for little kingdoms to get established. That's what I mean by petty kingdom, right? Petty is in small kingdoms to be established, where a person or persons, but usually a person, starts gaining a disproportionate level of influence or power in that little sector. A classic example where this occurs is in youth groups. Churches should be absolutely discipling and ministering to our youth with great fervour and passion, especially in our time where our youth are so wayward, those of my generation and younger. At the same time, though, youth groups have a shocking propensity to turn into these kinds of petty kingdoms, mainly because the ministers of the church don't do due diligence in actually making sure that they're run properly. What generally speaking happens, not universally but overwhelmingly, is that the pastor or the pastors, the ministers of the church, basically hand the reins of the youth group to the 20-year-olds, to the 20-something-year-olds.
Leadership's the biggest problem in youth groups.
Yes, it always has been and always will be until that gets reformed or otherwise changed. Because what has happened in the last 20 to 30 years and beyond, especially the last 30 years, is that for some reason those in their 40s, 50s and 60s have thought, I would argue erroneously, that the young adults in their 20s, they're cool and they're young and they're hip or whatever, and they know how to relate to the teenagers and the kids.
They're our teachers in schools, though.
That's my problem with it. Yes,
that's my husband's problem with it too.
Yeah.
You can't believe how young our school teachers
So,
are.
Our school teachers are all 23 years old.
We used to get a lot of resistance because we were sort of like not teenagers and we were running youth group.
Yeah.
And I've actually had kids who have grown up throughout of our youth group going, oh, you guys ran the best youth group. Now we're going,
No, it is because exactly and that's why even for myself, I always go out of my way to say that the scenario that I'm in here should be an exception to the rule, right? The only reason, and not that I've pointed out all the time, but when the warrant comes up, the only reason I would argue, broadly speaking, there's many reasons, but the prevailing reason why I'm at where I'm at the age of 28 is because of this exact kind of irresponsibility. I was baptized at the age of 18, and all of 4 months later, I was thrown into a pulpit simply because I've always had a general ability to speak well. But I'm the first and the last person to point out that was so grossly irresponsible. That
you
never.
can say anything.
It's almost like you could have, if a new person comes and they want to do youth work, and you don't know them, you haven't known them as a Christian for a while, you just lock them straight in, or do you say,
Exactly, yeah.
I want to get to know you for a year first? And
Yeah, exactly, correct. It's just exactly right. The throwing me up in the pulpit after 4 months, and fortunately, but again, and when the biblical adage is when what you intended for evil, God intended for good. I suppose in this case, it's more what you decided in your utter irresponsibility and stupidity. God made it work in spite of your stupidity.
You're meant to be there.
But it's God working in spite of the stupidity of people, not. So then that's 4 months afterwards, and then it takes me about a month to realise, which is not long, and it only takes me a month to realise that I know nothing. So then that launches me into seminary, which was a good thing, obviously. So without that having happening, I wouldn't have gone to seminary. And you can see the cascade going forward. But point being that in 99% of instances, no, a church should, generally speaking, absolutely not hire a 28-year-old, for sure. And that's not because, but that's not, people often confuse that and think that I'm saying that I'm somehow special. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is the only reason I'm at where I'm at 28 is because I got tossed into the deep end of the pool 10 years ago.
Yeah, baptism of fire, we call it.
Yeah. So it's a decade for me now, but it shouldn't have never been. My decade maybe should have been starting maybe now, maybe, if that. Or give it another 10 years and wait till I'm 38 and then maybe the decade can start.
One of the best
That's what should have happened.
pastors, ministers I ever had actually didn't go in to become one till he's late 50s.
Yeah, which is all good. And that's
he's a very grounded man.
Yeah, exactly. There's no problems then, because that's how it should be. But the issues with the youth group side, the whole point of the Petty Kingdoms is that it's the antithesis of that. Basically, it becomes pure pragmatism, whereas, and this is the kind of big point here as well, especially because he's speaking to the Ephesians, to whom he writes the letter to Timothy. Obviously, Timothy as one of the figures here. There's two seminal texts in the New Testament. Obviously, you have to read the Old Testament as well, but there's two seminal texts in the New Testament concerning who's qualified for leadership in the church, right? 2 Timothy and in Titus, okay? Now, what's fascinating when you read those two, and they're both mirrored heavily. In fact, certain portions say almost the exact same thing. He's writing to Titus in Crete, he's writing to Timothy in Ephesus. What's fascinating about those assortment of qualifications for bishops and then deacons, as the two kind of orders of the church, the two holy orders, is that virtually every single qualification, maybe with the exception of able to teach, which I can comment on in a minute, every single other qualification, the 13 or so that it is, roughly 12 or 13, are all entirely character attributes and have nothing to do with talent. Disciplined, sober, so in other words, not addicted to drunkenness, husband of one wife. But all of that's character.
What was the last one? Sorry?
Husband
of one wife, so he's not like
polygamous.
not polygamous.
Oh right.
Yes,
yes.
like was around in ancient cultures. Yeah. So doesn't have multiple wives like you had or mistresses and everything else, which was common. Well, the Romans had monogamous marriage, but then you could have a bunch of mistresses.
Yeah.
So they had monogamous marriage, only one wife, but you could then also have mistresses.
Yeah.
So in other words, husband of one wife and only one wife. Is the point being made there. But either way, all those other things, blah, 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 and the list goes on, are all character attributes. They have nothing to... So self-discipline has nothing to do with talent, right? All the pragmatic actions that come forward are always based on the character. So all those things are all character attributes. But that's completely inverse to how we often do these things today, especially in certain evangelical circles, how good can he preach? And is he good in visitation? And how's he good? Is he good with this? And how well does he run the prayer meeting? But it's all the pragmatic stuff. It's entirely flipped on its head, because all the things are all actually character qualifications, not pragmatics. Like I've sat through church meetings where a church has been calling a new pastor, and like the 15 to 20 minute, like the 20-minute presentation, like 15 minutes of it was about how much he liked hiking, and he has a dog, and he really enjoys it. Like God bless your heart. Who gives a stuff?
Yeah, it's more resume than it is actually.
It's a resume, correct. It's a resume because we're treating it like a business.
Yeah. I had the same problem with one of the other boards.
Yeah.
Treated it like a business.
It's treating like a business, and so that's why then you get this accumulation of things. It doesn't mean that there's not so with a church that has a whole board of deacons, right? What they do what they do or don't do in their job description. No, that makes sense. You want to have certain people responsible for certain things here. But if you look at especially what we would broadly consider a mega church or larger churches that are, and that depends what that definition is, depends on the country you're in. But generally speaking, when you're in the thousands, or in Australia, kind of high hundreds to the thousands, you've got the elder board essentially ends up mimicking a board of directors, and all these other roles have, executive director of blah, 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 and assistant executive of this and that. Like it's all just literally just corporate job descriptions, right?
Yeah.
With our award schemes and not because ministers shouldn't be paid, but it's the complete corporatization of it.
I'm surprised there's no KPIs involved.
Yeah, I've said that before. I've said the exact same thing. I'm surprised. The only thing that's ever shocked me is there's no KPIs involved. I've said that the exact same thing before. Is that, yeah, exactly, because it's the complete corporatization of it, and that's ended up mirrored and reflected with middle management positions and boards of directors, and the pastor is essentially just the chairman or the CEO, right? That's how it ends up functioning, and so that's part of to the caving of these things. But you don't defend or protect against these things by doing that. So he admonishes them to be watchful. Verse 31, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years, I did not cease to admonish each one of you with tears. So he's pointing to his dedication, right? He's highlighting the fact that...
And the word admonish, as in...
Yeah.
That's a particularly,
Yeah.
It's more than just encourage.
No, it's much more than just, yeah. Admonishing is well, especially in the Greek context here, admonishing meaning to encourage, but it's encouraging you to do better. It's not just like a general, hey, you're all over this like a red rash. Keep going. No, it's admonishing you to do better.
Yes, you won that race in about X number of seconds, but surely you can do better next time.
Yes, correct. Yes, yes, exactly. It's not like it's not designed to crush. It's meant to improve. Strive for greater heights than what you're currently at. Yes.
To be.
Yeah, potential. Yes, exactly. Yes, and that's why you get all those kinds of analogies of potentiality, especially in Hebrews, which I would obviously it's unattributed, but I would argue it's a sermon that Paul gave that Luke wrote. So admonishing them to, but again, pointing to his example, not because he's the ultimate example, but because if he's imitating Christ, then anyone who imitates him is going to imitate Christ. But pointing to his dedication for that 3 years is kind of part of the emphasis of the sentence. And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among all those who have been sanctified.
My version has entrust.
Same thing, yeah. To commend you to God or entrust you to God. Yeah, to commend you and entrust is the same. It's the exact same. It's all within the semantic range of that word in the Greek. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Entrust you, to commend you to something means to point. To commend, kind of in English, would carry the connotation of pointing towards something and saying that's the way. That's a good way to go, like commending it. And we have that obviously. Do you recommend this restaurant? Yes, I recommend it. Yes, this is a good way to. So entrusting it to it. Yes, entrusted also works there as well perfectly. Okay. Entrust you to God and to the word of His grace. So to God and to the Scriptures, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all those who have been sanctified. Fairly self-explanatory. Verse 33, and I have coveted no one's silver or gold or clothes. Right, kind of what we've been talking about. He's not in it for personal gain. He's not in it for riches, but those who rise up from within, like he was warning against earlier, often do.
Wow. Most of the time he was working his own way through as a tent maker.
Which is exactly the point he's drawing, yeah. You yourselves know, verse 34, that these hands ministered to my own needs and to those who were with me. Right? So he wasn't in the church for wealth extraction. He based on his circumstance and his skills, paid his own way, so it were. Is that
to counter an argument the Jews were making against?
No doubt, no question. Just like probably the other stuff was, he's in it for fame and he's in it for glory. That's all part of the duplicity of the attacks of the Jews of claiming that as if it wasn't bad enough that they attributed to him the death of those Christians that they themselves killed. This is really Paul's fault because he's made us kill these Christians. As if that wasn't dark enough. Saying that he's in this for personal gain, or he's in it for it's his pride, his ego. He thinks he's better than us. He thinks he knows more. He thinks he knows the Scriptures more than we do. He does. He does know the Scriptures better, and he's proved it time and time again. Yes, correct. There's nothing wrong with being better than someone. It's just not boasting in it. Right? So the Apostle Paul absolutely knew better than them, and he knew the Scriptures better than them, and he knew the Scriptures better than them before he'd even converted to Christianity, but especially after he had. So that's so the thing is that Paul doesn't engage in faux humility, right? False humility in other words. Faux humility isn't humility. It's actually pride, trying to masquerade as humility, just like the exact descriptors of wolves in sheep's clothing are, right? There's nothing, faux humility is not genuine humility. It's why I think, yes, it would have been, it was C.S. Lewis who said, humility is not talking less of yourself, it's talking about yourself less.
Yes, yeah.
And it's also it's an
Yeah.
honesty, right?
Yeah, it's honesty.
So if I'm able to do that, and I say I'm able to do that,
Yeah.
because I know I'm able to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not boasting about
No,
it.
and you're using it
It's
as
fact.
a service, like he's talking about. That's his whole point. And in verse end of verse 32, verse 34, and in terms of ministering to my own hands and to those who were with me, right? So he was employing his skills to help those around him, right? Humility is important to keep in check, but humility doesn't change the fact that someone might be extremely talented at something.
I've hit that time again where I've said to certain people, look, I can do this, and they go, oh, I don't know how to do it. And then they do it, and they go like, oh, wow, you can actually do it.
Yeah, correct. Because God gives us the gifts of these various talents to use them, not to hide them away. Humility. I get uncomfortable talking about myself because, fortunately, I've grown in humility over the course of decades now. So I don't like talking about myself. But am I doing anyone favors to pretend that I'm a simpleton or an idiot who can't explain concepts? Well, no. Generally speaking, when I open my mouth, it's fairly self-evident. But I don't need to tell people that. I just do it.
I know one time when I set up the local radio station up here,
Yeah.
the guy who was running it, oh, you're the real McCoy, you know.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But yeah, so it's using talents for God is appropriate, and in fact, actually not doing. There is as much error in not doing what God has told you to do than in doing something that God didn't tell you to do. Almost vis-a-vis, like we talked about with the third commandment for this sermon series. Taking God's name in vain ultimately is attaching God to falsehood or attributing to him otherwise falsehood. So not doing what God said to do or doing things that God didn't say to do. So in other words, that's the whole concept of a false prophet, right? Taking God's name in vain is saying, thus saith the Lord, but he didn't actually say that. It's the same thing with skill sets or with talents. If God has given you a skill set to then use for service, right? He's given it to you for a purpose, for the building up of his kingdom in the world. If you squander that and don't use it, you are actually in rebellion and you're not obeying God.